Sorry for the delay. Hey guys, today I'm going to be making another video. This time I'm actually going to be doing it on APUSH, specifically for periods 5 and 6, and this is going to be on the 2020 exam, and this is just a last minute review of just some terms that I think are worth remembering. Some of them are more important than the others, but I'm going to go over a little bit where I talk about Reconstruction and why that has a potential not a potential, but why I'm going to be covering that. I'm going to be covering a little bit. So I'm just going to explain some terms specifically about Reconstruction, and well, let's get right into it. So first, I'm going to start with the Appomattox Courthouse. This happened 1865. It's the last battle in the Civil War. It wasn't really a battle. It ended the Civil War, and it changed the Southern ideology. It made it so being Southern didn't equate to supporting slavery, meaning that before you could bring this as a sort of change in continuity in a DBQ, assuming it's a change in continuity DBQ. So basically, if you basically before, the whole idea of the South was cotton is king and our economy is based on slavery. And that was a central part to the Southern ideology before the Civil War. After the Civil War, you see generals surrendering their slaves, essentially surrendering their slaves, because at this point, I believe the 13th Amendment has been passed in America. And so since all the armies have surrendered, there's no hope for the South to win the war. And this battle, again in quotes, kind of seals that. We also have the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And this might not seem like irrelevant. Usually assassinations in American history they are significant, but they aren't seen as significant as some other things. But I think the assassination of Lincoln is particularly important because it the assassin believed that Booth is the assassin, by the way. He thought that Lincoln would punish the South severely for what they did. Lincoln went really hard during the Civil War. Harder on the South than most people expected him to, and so he thought that Lincoln was a tyrant. That was actually like some of the words that he said when he killed Lincoln. And so Booth killing Lincoln is significant in that way, is that Lincoln didn't actually want to harm the South. Lincoln wanted to make sure the South was A-okay and actually reintegrated back into the American States, without slavery, of course, because he'd passed the 13th Amendment. That would be the main difference between post and pre-Civil War. That was in Lincoln's eyes. Booth thought that Lincoln would punish the South severely. The opposite was true afterward. Yeah, so that's basically the main reason. You could also use this in terms of a DBQ, possibly, I'm not really exactly sure, maybe similarities and differences, maybe change in continuity in terms of maybe continuous in the feeling throughout the Civil War. Maybe if a DBQ showed up like this, it was about like the Southern feelings during the Civil War. Maybe it was like that. You could bring Booth's assassination as maybe a sense of continuity, whether your argument is for or against continuity during this time period. Next, we have some Reconstruction terms, and I'd strongly advise check out Jocz Productions, and he tries to guess the APUSH DBQ topic for 2020. So I left some time. I'm just going to go through a quick run through of some Reconstruction terms here that were relevant during this time period. And yeah, he tries to guess it for 2020 because it's just a DBQ this year. And I'm going to put the link to his video where he guesses the APUSH topic in the description down below. Alright, so the Freedmen's Bureau. This was basically an incentive to, not really an incentive, a bureau, a group made to reintegrate the South. More specifically, it was to help African Americans, hence the name Freedmen's Bureau. I might have these terms repeated in a bit more detail, so I'm going to just gloss over them right now. But and we also have Waving the Bloody Shirt, and this was basically where Grant and his supporters try to use they try waving the bloody shirt as a metaphor, meaning they're showing, hey, look at what the Democrats did, because the Democrats at this time were blamed for kind of splitting the Union and destroying destroying the U.S. as a whole, almost destroying. The South obviously lost the Civil War. Then we have the election of 76, and 77. This was also is known as the second corrupt bargain in American history. The first being the election of 1824, and the other one being Gerald R. Ford pardoning Nixon after his impeachment. And so those were this is the second of the three. Only the first two are going to be even possibly relevant to this year, because the one where I mentioned Ford and Nixon, that corrupt bargain is not going to be on the 2020 DBQ because period 8 is out. Then we go on to some effects of Reconstruction. And maybe if this is a cause and effect, you can kind of use this. I didn't mention them all. I was going to put more, but I wanted to get this video out since the APUSH exam is so fast. I just forgot to mention. But I'll just say them verbally. Hopefully you're listening. So we got Jim Crow segregation, which I did put down. It's kind of a thin link. It has more to do with Plessy v. Ferguson, but it does have some effects as to how much you could bring this as a sort of continuity. Maybe if it's continuity as well, show how the South didn't change, assuming whatever period, like however long the period is. We could also put in the grandfather clause, poll taxes, and so the grandfather clause was basically saying if your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't vote. That's the basic idea of the grandfather clause. And this was specifically targeted towards African Americans because their grandfathers couldn't vote because their grandfathers were in slavery. And so African Americans for many, many years could not vote in elections, and they were underrepresented, and that is also where we got the term the Solid South, because even though there were so many African Americans in the South, they didn't have the amount of representation, and you see the Democrats consistently get the South, if you will. They constantly win in the South. And another term would be poll taxes, where taxes were put, where there was a tax on voting, and this was again, many African Americans at this time were in poverty and they couldn't pay their taxes, and this was a huge disincentive to vote. If you guys can think of any more, leave them down in the comments below. I'd love to know because I'm taking the APUSH exam in just a few days. I wanted to do this as a review for both you and me. We could also bring in Plessy v. Ferguson, segregation in train cars. At this time, there were no cars at this time, as far as I remember. But we have Plessy v. Ferguson, which legalizes Jim Crow segregation, as I mentioned earlier. You can see it on the slide. And it also brings out the idea of separate but equal. And so those terms become pretty major during this time. Well, until the Civil Rights era, but there's no civil rights. There's no major, the Civil Rights movement is not going to be in this year's DBQ because it is in period 8, and we are focusing on periods 3 through 7. And so we also have sharecropping. This was happening during Reconstruction. I know this ordering is weird, but I made this pretty fast. Sharecropping was the idea where it's kind of known as slavery by another name. And it essentially was. And with the combination of black codes in the next bullet point, they kept slaves kind of entitled to farms, to plantations. They would pay them, but it would be so little, and African Americans would be forced to give up their crops to their master's tenant. So it was essentially tenant farming. It was a form of tenant farming, and there was very little change. And let's say it was a change in continuity DBQ for Reconstruction. You could bring this up as an example of lack of change in the South. I actually, when I wrote a practice DBQ about Reconstruction, I actually brought up sharecropping, black codes. Oh, I mentioned black codes twice. I didn't even notice. Yeah, so I mentioned those. One thing about change, though, you could mention is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and what these were. I'm just gonna name them out. The 13th Amendment, we got the 13th Amendment. It freed African Americans and any slaves, specifically African Americans, because they were the main primary concern during this time. 14th, you have it gives everyone the right to vote. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Sorry, that's 15th. 15th is the one that gives the right to vote. 14th is the one that gives citizenship to all of those who were born and naturalized in the United States, including former slaves. So African Americans didn't have to worry about their citizenship. They're also given the right to vote, which was protected during Reconstruction. Maybe not in the best way, but there was military occupation in the South during Reconstruction, and this did help to bring out and preserve some of African Americans' rights, which were not being upheld all the time. So we got the Freedmen's Bureau, as I mentioned, 13th Amendment. I already mentioned these. One thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did that I didn't mention earlier, it helped on education a lot, and it specifically made it so academics one of its major parts of it was education. That's what I missed. And you have the 13th Amendment as well. I mentioned that. We have the purchase of Alaska, and we're going away from the topic of Reconstruction right now. Andrew Johnson, though, even though these are in Reconstruction, the purchase of Alaska has more to do with period 6 and the Gilded Age and imperialism rather than Reconstruction. So the purchase of Alaska has a lot of resources, and it was bought by America from the Russian Empire, Russian Tsardom, and it was looking to expand to both coasts. And at this time, America has expanded from what we call sea to shining sea, and it's trying to get more land. This helps a lot with future ambitions in Asia and the Pacific. And also, adding on, we also see that from this, you also see America sticking to the Monroe Doctrine. So if you want to talk about their, how do I say this? Their foreign policy continuity. Let's say it's about foreign policy over to this period. You could mention this as a potential of trying to keep Europe, Russia, who's not really it's a major power, but more it's considered a European power. It's referred to more as a major European power than an Asian power, even though it's both. It was mostly known as being a European power. Therefore, America didn't want a European country, Russia, coming in and taking anything from the Western Hemisphere, and so they wanted to keep Russia out. You know, they didn't want a war at this time, just finish the Civil War, so it would be bad to get back into a war. So therefore they bought this land, and it turned out to be very valuable for America. We also have Andrew Johnson. He is almost impeached. He's not really liked by either party, even though he identifies as a Democrat, and he was nearly impeached, by the way, I forgot to mention. His Secretary of War wanted more aggressive Reconstruction policies. At this time, Andrew Johnson was not at all. He was very lenient. He didn't want to anger the South at all, and he was very laid back as a president. He didn't do much during his presidency, and he was almost impeached because he dismissed his Secretary of War. And as you can see, more aggressive Reconstruction policies is what he wanted. 14th Amendment, I mentioned already. So it changed the idea that the Constitution applies to white citizens. It now applies to American citizens, anyone naturalized or born in America. This included African Americans, and this was important. 1869, you have the Transcontinental Railroad, and my recording bar is in the way, but I believe it says Greater National Connection. It put another nail in the... So, before the Civil War, there was this idea floating around. Sorry about any background noise, by the way. There was this idea that floated around before the Civil War that it wasn't really an idea, it was the thought process that Americans had. They identified more with their state than the federal government. And this kind of broke that, because now with this Transcontinental Railroad, you see a greater sense of national unity, and this kind of enhances this idea that is gained after the Civil War, that we are not a citizen, that I'm not a citizen from Texas or South Carolina or Massachusetts or Illinois. It brings the idea that we aren't from these individual states, but instead we're American citizens. And this gets the idea rolling that America can unify itself and become its own thing, really. And it helps to industrialize America, helps boost the economy because now it connects both east and west via land. Before, you've heard the stories of pioneers venturing out, and this was a very slow, dangerous journey. Now this is much more sped up with the Transcontinental Railroad, and it helped movement, westward expansion, as I mentioned earlier. Standard Oil, 1870, and this is when it was established. You have John D. Rockefeller being the main guy establishing this, and he's brought in the idea of big corporations, specifically monopolies and trusts, where big companies would join together and make a monopoly. Horizontal integration is how he did this. He joined a lot of competitors together, and they would be raising and lowering prices at their own will. Therefore, competition would be scarce, and they would have control over the entire oil market. And this is where we later see Theodore's trust busting. He tries to break up big companies who are dominant and pricing things much too high. Then we have 1869, the Knights of Labor, and these guys were pretty much the first major labor organization. They wanted fairer wages, and they helped the growing number of laborers in the early Gilded Age. Increasing wages was one of their central ideas that should happen. This particular group didn't work out too well. There's another group, the American Federation of Labor, I believe, and they worked out much better, and I believe they're even still around today, if I'm correct. We're gonna go, okay, so these are the last two. We got Wyoming, and this one is specific for women's suffrage, for the women's suffrage movement. In 1869, they became the first state to give women the right to vote, and and this was because women played a much bigger role in everyday life. In the East, you saw them working in factories, but not you saw them working in factories and doing other things, but you wouldn't see them. But they did a lot of work, but you still had this idea in the East and the uh, and the and mostly in the Northeast, where we see what we consider today as the East Coast. That used to be the portion where uh, women's suffrage was very weakly held, um, and so um, it was they felt much safer giving women the right to vote. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. This was a battle between Native Americans and Americans, and even though because the Native Americans won, Americans began to see them as wild creatures. This led to the Dawes Severalty Act, and maybe I'll mention that in another APUSH terms video. And besides, we're done. I'm sorry this is so long. 12 terms took me more than 20 minutes. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to put this video out for you guys. Leave a comment down below. Should I put more terms, less terms, something completely different? Maybe this isn't the best way of just getting you to learn things. Some feedback, love that. I've mentioned that a couple of times in my videos. So yeah, go to my Discord, links there, gaming channel if you want to check that out too. I'll put those in the description. And good luck on your APUSH exam, period 5-6 test, whatever you're watching this video for. Please leave feedback, greatly appreciated. Leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more of this, and thank you.